Hello everyone! Welcome to Gary's Math Help. This is the second of several videos on the topic of mnemonics. We have more of Higby's excellent book to do. Last time, in Chapter 7, we learned what mnemonics are and where the word mnemonic comes from, and then looked at the principles and some examples of verbal and visual mnemonics. We also looked at a few keyword mnemonics and discovered how to make effective visual associations. In this video covering Chapter 8, we'll talk about things that mnemonics really can't do, as well as some things that some people say that mnemonics can't do. Without further ado, let's dive in. The things that mnemonics can accomplish are pretty amazing. Joshua Foer had never even heard of mnemonics in 2005, and only 1 year later he actually won the USA Memory Championship after some pretty intensive studying. The contestants in the championship are referred to as memory athletes, and they have to perform such tasks as memorizing names and faces, memorizing random numbers, memorizing the order of decks of playing cards. Foer later wrote a best-selling book about his experience with a $1.1 million advance. Just so you know, one criticism of the book is that while it's an amazing story, it doesn't quite go into enough detail to really teach you the mnemonic techniques that Foer used. But that's okay, that's what this series of videos is for. The World Memory Championships are a little older than the USA Memory Championship and go back 30 years. These were started by Tony Buzan, who you might recall invented the idea of mind maps. In the World Memory Championships, there are 10 different events, all of them timed, and the results achieved are ridiculously impressive. For example, here are some of the current records. In 1 hour, memorize 4,620 random digits. In 5 minutes, memorize 630 digits. In 1 hour, memorize the order of 2,530 shuffled cards. And if that feels like too many cards for you, you could just memorize the order of cards in one single shuffled deck. The current record is 12.74 seconds. Despite these feats, all of which use mnemonics, Higby reminds us that we learned a long time ago, we talked about this in an earlier video, that it's a myth to think there's any such thing as memory magic. A trained memory can still forget without sufficient review. Mnemonics are as close to magic as we can get, but they still have several limitations. In fact, there are several real limitations of mnemonics and what they can accomplish. Higby lists 7 of these limitations, and we'll go through them one by one. The first limitation we'll talk about is time. For example, in the previous video, we saw how the keyword memory technique can be used for learning foreign language vocabulary, and in particular, we created a silly image of a duck with a pot on its head in order to remember that the Spanish word for duck is pato. This is a great technique, it really does work, but it takes a little bit of time to think up an effective visualization. If you're sitting at your desk or in a nice comfy chair and you're looking over material you need to memorize, this isn't an issue, but if the material is coming at you fast, there might not be enough time to come up with good visualizations. Wait, you say, we just saw that the memory champions are memorizing an entire deck of cards in about 12 seconds, so they're creating visualizations at a rate of more than 4 per second. Isn't that fast enough? Well, sure, but those are champions. I could run 100 meters. Well, I could if I were being chased by a bear. But I'm still not going to get anywhere close to Usain Bolt's time. If you're an ordinary mortal like me, then you'll find that your typical visualization speed is a couple seconds per item with practice, and probably about 10 seconds per item as a beginner. That still seems pretty fast to me, but there are other issues with time. Retrieval time with mnemonics also takes a little longer than directly remembering. If I know that the Spanish word for duck is pato, then I just say it, and it takes virtually no time at all. But if I'm still using the mnemonic, then I have to hear the word duck, and then think for a little bit to come up with the silly image of the duck with the pot on its head, and then think about the keyword pot, and then finally come up with the Spanish word pato. So this takes a little bit longer. We'll talk a bit more about this later in this video. Mnemonics also have some limitations on how well they work with abstract material. For one thing, as we saw in the introductory video, a typical way to remember abstract material is to come up with a concrete equivalent, like the concrete Liberty Bell instead of the abstract Liberty. Well, it takes a little more time to think up these concrete images. Another issue might be a bit more serious. What does the Liberty Bell image mean? Well, obviously it's a bell. So I guess you were memorizing something about a bell, right? No. This could cause a problem later when retrieving the memory. Third, Higbee gives some examples of abstract ideas that are just really difficult to concretize. What mental images can you come up with for assertion, or theory, or analysis, or inference? Visualizing something concrete might take longer and then still not be a really good concretization. By the way, Harry Lorraine in his books says to just use a keyword in cases like this, so he doesn't think this is a real problem. So instead of assertion, you might think of a surgeon visualizing a doctor with a scalpel and some blood smeared over his coat. For theory, you might use the French name Thierry, spelled Thierry, and think of someone you know who's named Thierry. Yeah, except I don't know anyone named Thierry, so this isn't a great solution for me. Let's just say that this can be kind of difficult. I had to Google to find anything that sounded like our abstract word theory, and thinking of a surgeon as a keyword for assertion didn't require the internet, but still took me longer than I wanted it to. But looking for keywords for abstract ideas can be kind of fun. For inference, I could think of someone wearing one of those fake bear suits they used to use in old movies, so the person is in fur. Get it? Fur? Anyway, you could probably come up with better keywords yourself. Bottom line, abstract material really is harder, so this is a limitation, but you can use mnemonics with abstract material. It just takes more time and more effort. I've mentioned several times in this series of videos that one of the really nice things about Higbee's book is that it's so scholarly. He's not just talking through his hat, he's an expert in the field of memory, and the book closes with 32 pages of footnotes. Some of those footnotes lead to articles about whether mnemonics help just with initial learning, and obviously they do, or whether they also help with long-term retention. And the conclusion reached by various researchers is, well, we're not really sure. Every researcher agrees that mnemonics help us to learn material faster, but results are mixed as to whether they help to learn things longer. Why wouldn't we know by now? Well, for one thing, there are various ways to measure retention. The details get a bit technical, but the bottom line is that some measures of retention would say that mnemonics help in the long term, while other ways to measure retention suggest that they don't. So, this might be a real limitation, or it might not be. Anyway, bottom line is that it might not matter. Way back in an earlier video, we saw that the real key to retention is how well you have learned something. If you've mastered it, then you'll remember it longer. But if you've just dabbled, you'll forget sooner. So, how can you learn something at a deeper level? The principle we talked about earlier was overlearning, which is great but requires more time. Fortunately, mnemonics save time when initially learning something, so you will have extra time for overlearning if you use mnemonics. Wait a second, Gary. I thought you just said a minute ago that one limitation of mnemonics is that they take time. But now you're saying they're faster. What gives? Okay, nice catch. So let's clarify. If information is coming at you multiple items a second, then that's too fast to make good visualizations, so mnemonics has a limitation. But if you're studying at your own pace, then mnemonics do help you learn faster, and if you practice, you can get pretty much as fast as you would want. In our introductory video, we talked about ways to come up with more effective visualizations. And I'll admit here that the reason we talked about that is that some people just aren't very good at visualization. Younger children are usually better, and older people are usually a little worse. But again, I don't think this really matters. If you're not good at visualization, then practice, and you'll get better at it. Higbee has a slew of footnotes with various researchers finding that certain categories of people can improve if they try. I can't think of anyone who wouldn't be in this list, so go for it. If you really think that you aren't good at visualization, even after honest practice, then you can always use verbal mnemonics, but those aren't quite as good as visual mnemonics. If you want to memorize something word for word, like a poem or a Bible verse or lines from a play, then sorry, mnemonics don't really help much. You have to use some of the more general memory techniques that we covered earlier when talking about study skills. But mnemonics can help to memorize the general structure of something, like the chapters and paragraphs and main ideas, which can help later when memorizing the exact words. In our introductory video, we said that one of the reasons mnemonics help is that they reduce interference, but we didn't go into any examples. One that Higbee mentions is that you could use the same mnemonic technique to memorize several different lists of items, and surprisingly enough, there is less interference from list to list by using mnemonics than if the lists were memorized some other way. Unfortunately, we now have to admit that visualization adds in its own layer of possible interference, which we've already alluded to. If your visualization is the Liberty Bell, then how can you tell later whether you were trying to remember Liberty or were trying to remember Bell? And this isn't an issue just with abstract material. If your visualization is a baby, how do you know whether you weren't trying to remember child or infant or newborn? This doesn't actually happen very often, but when it does, it's annoying. Visual mnemonics are still better than verbal mnemonics most of the time. Okay, we're finally at the limitation that matters to me the most. Well, actually, it doesn't matter to me at all, but it matters to you, which means that it matters to me because you are my students and I'm trying to teach you about mnemonics. Wait, what? The point I'm trying to make is that you've all seen the keyword mnemonic PEMDAS to remember the order of operations in an algebraic expression, and Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow. But does that mean that when you encounter the 6 phases of mitosis that you are going to create your own keyword mnemonic to remember them? If I teach you how to memorize foreign language vocabulary, will you go on and use similar techniques to memorize technical vocabulary from other topics? This matters to me because if you're not going to ever use the super neato techniques that I'll teach you in the next few videos, then we're both wasting our time. So let me tell you the good news and the bad news. First, the bad news. Most researchers, and Higbee himself in his own memory classes, find that the ordinary person does not maintain and transfer their abilities with mnemonics into new material. That sucks. But here's the good news. You get to decide for yourself. There's no researcher who is going to stop you later if you want to use mnemonics in one of your classes. So do take advantage of these techniques and systems because I know for a fact that they make memorization easier. And the ability to memorize is a pretty useful skill in college and in the rest of your lives as well. Besides the real limitations of mnemonics, there are also some pseudo limitations, where pseudo here means false. You'll hear people say sometimes that these are limitations of mnemonics, but they aren't really. Higbee lists 5 of these pseudo limitations, and we'll go through them one by one. The first pseudo limitation of mnemonics is that they're not really practical. We've already mentioned the sorts of memory feats that are displayed by the memory athletes at the U.S. and World Championships, but what are they good for? Who cares? Do mnemonics really change anyone's life? Well, for one thing, this definitely depends on the person. Some people do need to memorize lots of numbers for work. Maybe they're chemists or stockbrokers. And some people do want to memorize the order of a deck of cards, like, card counters at a blackjack table in Vegas. Besides these more or less obvious applications, you have to also understand that mnemonic techniques can be applied virtually to anything that a person needs to memorize. And again, that depends on the individual. If you have no interest in learning Spanish, then having an easy way to remember that pato means duck does you no good at all. But if you're planning a vacation to Barcelona, it could come in handy. You might not want to memorize a list of random numbers, but you might want to remember the combination to the lock on your suitcase, or the room number of your hotel, since those plastic keys don't tell you anymore. And so on. You could think of your own examples. If there's something you'd like to memorize, then there's a mnemonic technique that will help you do it. The second pseudo limitation of mnemonics is the claim that they don't help you understand something. This viewpoint distinguishes content from skills and says that skills are more important. For example, a popular misunderstanding of Bloom's taxonomy suggests that knowledge, meaning remembering previously learned information, is at the bottom as a lower order thinking skill. Let me just say, without putting too fine a point on it, that this is, well, total garbage. For one thing, this was never what Bloom and his team believed. And for another thing, it's just wrong. One of these days, I'll make a new video just on Bloom's taxonomy and how it is misinterpreted, and that video will go viral, and the world will overnight become a better place. Well, I can dream anyway. As another example, I'll mention something from my own field of mathematics. Jo Boaler is a British woman who is now a professor of mathematics education at Stanford. There's a lot of her work that I like and have used in the past, but she's on record as being against kids having to memorize the multiplication table. She would rather that kids gain a number sense so that they can quickly multiply in their heads if they don't remember a particular value. And that sounds good, but I think it's more difficult than using mnemonics to memorize the multiplication table, after which a student who uses it can be guided to gain a good number sense, which is a beautiful thing after all. Anyway, this slide's discussion is too long already, so let's move on. The third pseudo-limitation of mnemonics is that they give you more to remember. Originally, you just wanted to remember that the Spanish word pato means duck. That was just one thing. But now with mnemonics, you also have to remember that pato sounds like the English word pot, and then you have to remember this silly visualization of a duck with a pot on its head, and that's even more to remember. Well, all I can say is, you're right, there is more to remember. So what's the advantage of the mnemonic? It makes memorization easier because it adds meaning and organization to a pretty arbitrary relationship between two words. This means that even though there is a little bit more to remember, creating and using the mnemonic is still better because it eases the memory task. But let's not toss out this pseudo-limitation quite yet, because it's actually worse than this one keyword for a Spanish vocabulary item. In future videos, as we go through various mnemonic systems, you'll see that some of them require some rather significant pre-memorization. So, how can this be helpful? Well, for one thing, the extra stuff that you have to remember, and there will be some extra stuff that you have to remember, can be reused over and over again, so you only have to learn it once. Another point is that memory always requires work, no matter whether you use a mnemonic system or not. And I can tell you from my own experience that in the long run, mnemonics reduce that amount of work. And then again, how much you can memorize doesn't depend on how much stuff there is to remember, but how meaningful and organized it is. And mnemonics helps with that, as we just saw with pato. Don't worry about having to remember more stuff. Instead, worry about being able to memorize at all. The fourth pseudo-limitation of mnemonics is that mnemonics are artificial crutches, and if you forget the crutch, then you won't be able to remember that material. I joked about this in the introductory video when we parodied that Days in a Month poem with 30 days hath September, and all the rest I can't remember. So this seems more like a real limitation than a pseudo limitation, but we have some responses. First, if someone says, "What if you forget the crutch?" we can answer with, "What if you don't use a mnemonic and you forget the material?" The whole idea is that the mnemonic is an aid that makes it easier to remember. There's still no guarantee, but if you're the person who is likely to forget the mnemonic, and it happens, then for sure you're not going to remember the material without the mnemonic. Besides, what I find, and lots of other people who use mnemonics would tell you the same thing, is that after I use a mnemonic a few times to remember some material, I tend to remember the material without having to use the mnemonic. In many of these cases, I can still remember the stuff I wanted to remember, and I know that at one time I had a good mnemonic for it, but I can't for the life of me think of what the mnemonic was. I've totally forgotten the mnemonic, but I still know the stuff. Okay, but seriously, what if you become dependent on the mnemonic crutch and can't remember the material without using the mnemonic? Well, that's exactly what a crutch is for. I'm totally dependent upon my glasses in order to read, but I don't feel guilty about it or curse my glasses. The good part is I can read whatever I want if I'm wearing them. In the same way, if you can't remember something without a mnemonic, what's the problem? If you can remember it with the mnemonic, then you're good to go. The fifth and last pseudo-limitation of mnemonics is that mnemonics are tricks. And this one's quite personal with me. Here is a very fuzzy photo from the last century of me with my grandma, who you can tell was quite a bit shorter than I am. She never would have dreamed that someday her image would be in a video that was available for literally billions of people to see. Anyway, I was studying mnemonics. Yeah, I've been doing this a long time. And I managed to use a keyword system to memorize the names of all the US presidents. She was impressed, so I explained the keyword system that I was using, and she said, "Oh, it's just a trick." Well, I was really annoyed. The fact of the matter was that I was able to list off the names of the presidents, and for her to say it was just a trick felt to me as though she was denying the fact that I could do it. Was I cheating because I wasn't doing it the hard way? I think she would have accepted it if I had spent months repeating the names and learned them by rote. But this has always bugged me. I never talked to her about it, but I always think of this example when I'm teaching this section of Higby's book. It wasn't magic. We've already established that there's no magic system to memory. It was just a different kind of work, one that added meaningfulness and organization to a pretty arbitrary list of names. So those are some limitations and pseudo-limitations of mnemonics. Thanks for watching.